Jack had never considered himself the type to intervene in the struggles of others, especially not when it came to strange alien beings. But that night, as he walked home under the dim light of street lamps, something made him stop. The streets, usually filled with noise and movement, were quiet, almost eerily so. The cold breeze carried the smell of rain, and the air felt thick, like something was about to change. As Jack passed the alley near the abandoned warehouse, he heard the faint sound of weak voices, a cry for help. He froze for a moment, unsure whether he had imagined it, but then it came again. Curiosity tugged at him, and against his better judgment, he turned toward the alley. There, beneath a pile of discarded boxes and plastic bags, were two figures. His heart skipped a beat. One was a woman lying on the ground, barely moving, her clothes torn and stained. The other was a small child, huddled close to her mother. Trembling with fear, Jack's first instinct was to turn away. But something about their state so vulnerable and helpless stopped him. He approached slowly, his steps hesitant. The woman's skin was an unusual shade of deep blue, a color unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Her eyes, though half-closed in exhaustion, were filled with something he couldn't quite place: pain, fear, or perhaps both. "Are you all right?" Jack asked quietly, not wanting to startle them. The woman's head turned weakly toward him, her gaze meeting his for just a moment before she fell back, her body going limp. The child, her daughter, Jack assumed crawled toward her, her eyes wide with terror, her small hands clutching the woman's arm. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't leave them there. Not like this. He knelt beside them, cautiously, reaching out to touch the woman's arm, finding it cold to the touch. Her skin felt unnaturally smooth, like the surface of water, and her pulse was faint, almost non-existent. Without thinking, Jack scooped the woman up in his arms, holding her gently but firmly, careful not to hurt her further. The child, still clutching her mother's arm, looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. She was a tiny thing, barely the size of a small human child, but her alien features were striking, even more so than her mother's. "Don't worry, I'll help you both," Jack whispered softly, unsure if the child understood him. But he hoped the tone of his voice would offer some comfort. He stood up, balancing the woman in his arms while trying to reassure the girl. Child's small form seemed so fragile, and Jack felt a protective instinct surge through him. He couldn't leave them here to die, abandoned in the cold, dark alley. He needed to get them to safety. He needed to save them. Jack's house was only a few blocks away, so he made his way there as quickly as he could. Every step felt heavy, the weight of the woman in his arms reminding him of the immense responsibility he had taken on in that instant. He couldn't let them down. When he reached his front door, Jack struggled to get the key out of his pocket. His hands were trembling, but he eventually managed to unlock the door. He pushed it open with his shoulder, carefully stepping inside and kicking the door shut behind him. He walked down the hall, his mind racing. What should he do? What if this was some kind of trap? But when he looked at the woman and the child, something inside told him that they weren't dangerous, at least not to him. They were just lost, and in need of help. He gently laid the woman down on the couch, still cradling her as though she might break into a million pieces if he was too rough. The child watched silently from the doorway, her tiny hands clutching the frame as she stared at Jack with wide, curious eyes. Jack quickly checked the woman's vitals, noting the rapid and shallow breaths, the cold skin, the faint pulse. She needed medical attention immediately. He rushed to the kitchen to grab a bottle of water, some food, and anything else that might help. When he returned, he found the child still standing in the doorway, unmoving. Her wide eyes followed every movement he made. "Hey, you're safe." "Now," Jack said softly, trying to reassure her. He knelt down so that he was eye level with the small alien girl. "I'm Jack. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer, but she took a tentative step closer. Jack smiled gently, offering her the water bottle. Slowly, hesitantly, she accepted it, drinking it in small sips. Jack couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed. She wasn't like any child he had ever met, but there was something universal in her fear. The fear of being alone, of being abandoned. He understood that. The woman stirred on the couch, letting out a low groan. Jack quickly returned to her side, his heart racing. "Hey, it's okay," he whispered, his voice filled with reassurance. "I've got you. I'll take care of you both." The alien woman opened her eyes slowly, her gaze unfocused at first. Then, as her vision cleared, she looked up at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You helped us?" she asked in a weak voice, her words slow but clear. Jack nodded. "Of course. You needed help. You're safe now." The alien woman took a shallow breath, her eyes searching Jack's face. "Thank you," she whispered, as though she couldn't quite believe it. "I thought we were going to die." Jack's heart ached as he looked at her. He had never expected his life to take such a strange turn, but here they were, two alien refugees in need of a home, and Jack had just become their savior. But as he looked at the child, standing silently in the doorway, Jack realized something. He wasn't just helping them survive. In some way, they had already started to change his life. Little did Jack know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would tie him to these strangers in ways he could never have imagined. The next few days passed in a blur for Jack. After helping the strange alien woman and her daughter, life had taken a turn he couldn't have predicted. Every morning he would wake up to find the alien woman Irith, as she had introduced herself, sitting on the couch, still weak but improving. Her daughter Nira had become a quiet presence in his home, her big eyes constantly observing, always a few steps behind her mother. The bond between them was undeniable, and Jack couldn't help but feel protective of them both. Irith had insisted on doing everything she could to help around the house, even though she was still weak. She would wash the dishes or help make simple meals, her hands moving slowly as if every action required great effort. Jack was always there to offer assistance, but Irith refused to let him do everything. She was determined to repay his kindness, though Jack reassured her that no payment was needed. One evening, after they had eaten a simple dinner together, Irith finally spoke of her past, her voice still raspy from the strain of not having spoken much in days. Jack had sensed that she was holding back, but he knew it would take time for her to open up. That night, as they sat in the living room, Jack encouraged her to tell him more. "I don't know where to begin," Irith said softly, her gaze distant. As she thought of the past, "Our people, my people, they were explorers. We traveled the stars, seeking new worlds, new resources. It was all about survival, finding places where we could live and thrive." Jack listened quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He could hear the sadness in her voice, the loss that echoed in every syllable. "My daughter Nira and I were part of a mission, one that was supposed to save our people," she continued. "We were sent to a distant planet to establish a colony. But they didn't go as planned. Our ship was damaged in an attack, and we crash-landed here on your world. At first, we thought we could fix the ship, that we could find our way back home. But as days passed, we realized there was no way to repair it. We were stuck, alone." Irith's voice trembled as she spoke of the terror she had faced in that crash, the pain of watching her fellow travelers perish as the ship fell from the sky. She spoke of how, when the rest of the crew had died, she had been forced to care for her daughter alone. She had scavenged for food and hidden from the world, doing anything she could to survive. "But what hurt the most," Irith whispered, looking down at her hands, was how we were abandoned. Our people left us behind. They didn't come for us. We were nothing more than a failed mission to them. We had no choice but to survive on our own, and when I found myself here, I had nothing left. Nothing except Nira. Jack's heart broke as he listened to her story. He had no idea how any creature, human or alien, could endure such hardship. The thought of being left alone on a foreign planet, without hope, was unimaginable. He could see the pain in Irith's eyes as she spoke of her past, the pain of abandonment, the fear of never being found. It was clear that she carried the weight of her people's failure on her shoulders. "How did you survive?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. "You and Nira. How did you manage?" Irith sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping as though the question was too heavy for her to answer. "We survived by hiding, by scavenging, but it was never enough. There were days when we didn't have food, when we had nothing to drink. I couldn't help her. I couldn't protect her the way I should have. I was weak. And when we found that pile of trash where you found us, I thought it was the end." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known they had been struggling, but he hadn't realized how desperate it had gotten. To think that Irith had been so close to giving up broke him. Nira, who had been sitting silently in the corner, watching the conversation unfold, suddenly spoke up. "Mama, don't be sad," she said softly, her small voice filled with a strange maturity for her age. "We're safe now. We have Jack." Irith smiled weakly at her daughter, brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "We have Jack." Jack didn't know what to say. What could he say? He wasn't some hero or savior. He was just a man who had decided to help. But hearing Irith's story, seeing how deeply she cared for Nira, made him realize how much their survival meant to her. They had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. And now, somehow, Jack had become their protector. "I promise," Jack said, his voice firm, "you're not alone anymore. I won't let anything happen to you or Nira. You have a home here with me." Irith's eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of hope crossed her face. "You mean it?" she asked, as if the words were too good to be true. "You would let us stay?" Jack nodded without hesitation. "Yes, of course. You're welcome here, both of you." Irith took a deep breath, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. For a moment, she seemed lost in her thoughts. Jack could only imagine the flood of emotions that must have been running through her, the grief, the fear, the relief. But in that moment, she was no longer alone. "Thank you," Irith said softly, her voice shaky. "Thank you for saving us." Jack smiled and shook his head. "I didn't save you. I just gave you a chance to survive. The real strength is in you, Irith, and in Nira." Irith glanced at her daughter, her gaze full of pride and love. "We wouldn't have made it without her," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "She's the reason I kept going. She's everything to me." Nira, who had been silently watching, smiled shyly. "Mama, Jack's nice." Jack chuckled softly, feeling his heart warm at the girl's innocent words. "I'm glad you think so, Nira." In the quiet that followed, Jack felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about offering shelter anymore. This was about something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. He was connected to them now, and they to him. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Jack found himself growing more attached to Irith and Nira. At first, it had felt like they were just guests in his home, strangers in need of help. But now, they were becoming a part of his life, his new family, in a way he never expected. Irith, though still weak and struggling to regain her strength, had slowly started to adapt to life in Jack's home. She helped around the house, tidying up, cooking meals when she could, and even taking care of the small things Jack hadn't noticed. It was clear that she was doing her best to repay Jack for his kindness, but Jack never expected anything in return. Her presence alone was enough. Nyra, the quiet little girl with her wide alien eyes, had settled into her new routine as well. She spent much of her time in the garden, exploring the small patch of land behind Jack's house. It seemed to be the only place where she truly felt comfortable, as if the outside world wasn't as threatening as it once had been. Jack often found her sitting by the flowers, her small hands gently touching the petals as she whispered to them. It was strange, but somehow beautiful to watch. Despite the language barrier, Jack had begun to understand Nyra. There was something about the way she looked at him that spoke volumes. She wasn't just observing. She was absorbing everything around her, trying to make sense of this new life. Jack could see that she was just a child, trying to make sense of her situation, trying to find safety in an unfamiliar world. One afternoon, as Jack worked on the garden, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Jack?" He turned to find Irith standing in the doorway, watching him with a soft expression. She looked better than she had in days, her skin no longer as pale, her movements steadier. It seemed the food, the rest, and the care had helped her more than Jack realized. "Hey, Irith," Jack greeted, wiping his hands on his pants. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm better," she said, her voice still soft, but with more strength behind it. "Thank you for everything." Jack smiled and motioned for her to join him. "Come on out here. I could use some help with the plants." Irith hesitated for a moment, but then stepped outside. She had grown more comfortable in the garden over the last few days. It had become her favorite place, a place of peace and healing. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound being the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird in the trees. Jack had never been much of a gardener, but he enjoyed the quiet and the sense of connection it gave him with the earth. Irith, on the other hand, seemed to have a natural gift for it. She knew how to handle the plants with care, gently pruning and replanting with a steady hand. "Irith," Jack said after a while, breaking the silence, "tell me more about your home. What was it like before everything happened?" Irith paused, looking down at the plants in front of her. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, as if trying to find the right words. "Our world was beautiful," she said quietly, her voice filled with a deep sadness. "It was a place of peace, harmony. We lived in cities that floated above the ground, surrounded by vast oceans and lush forests. The stars were always in our skies, guiding us." Jack listened intently, imagining the alien world she described. It sounded so different from Earth, so much more advanced, but also so far away. He couldn't imagine the kind of life Irith had left behind. But then, Irith continued, her voice trailing off, "We lost everything. Our people were scattered across the galaxy, and we had no way of reaching them. I don't know if they even know what happened to us. It was like we just vanished from their memory." Jack felt a pang of sorrow for her. She had lost so much. "And Nyra?" he asked, his voice gentle. "How has she been through all of this?" Irith's gaze softened as she looked over at her daughter, who was still sitting in the garden, her small hands playing with the dirt. "She's been my strength," Irith said quietly. "Even when everything felt hopeless, she was there. She kept me going. I couldn't let her see how scared I was. I had to be strong for her." Jack nodded, understanding. "It's amazing," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The bond between a mother and her child, it's unbreakable." Irith smiled faintly, a soft sadness in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed. "It's the one thing that kept us alive. Even when the world fell apart, I had Nyra, and that was enough to keep me going." Jack felt a surge of admiration for Irith, despite All the pain and suffering she had been through, she still had the strength to care for her daughter. She was a survivor, and Jack realized that, in a way, he had become a part of that survival. "Well," Jack said, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants, "I'm glad you two are here. You're both safe now, and that's all that matters." Iris looked at him, her expression softening. "I never thought I would find safety again," she said quietly, "but now I see that maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is where we're meant to be." Jack smiled warmly, his heart full. "I'm glad you think that. I want you to know that, no matter what, I'm here for both of you. You're not alone anymore." Iris's eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in them. She had been through so much, and yet, here she was still standing. She wasn't giving up, and neither was Naira. They had found something worth fighting for. As they continued to work in the garden, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land. Jack felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold for him, Iris and Naira, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, when Jack noticed something strange happening. It had been a few weeks since Iris and Naira had arrived, and life had settled into a gentle rhythm. Iris was recovering steadily, and Naira, though still quiet, had started to smile more often, especially when she was around Jack. The three of them had begun to form a strange, but comforting, family unit. However, as much as they had settled into their new life, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Iris and Naira than met the eye. Their abilities, whatever they were, had remained a mystery, though Jack had noticed small, unexplained things that had made him wonder. It happened one afternoon when Iris was working in the kitchen. Jack had been sitting in the living room, reading, when he heard a loud crash coming from the other room. He jumped up in surprise and rushed to the kitchen, his heart pounding. When he entered, he found Iris standing over a broken jar of jam, her face pale, her hand trembling as she stared at the shattered glass on the floor. "I'm sorry," Iris said quickly, her voice strained. "I didn't mean to." Before Jack could say anything, he noticed something strange. The broken pieces of glass, which should have been scattered across the floor, were slowly rising into the air. Jack's eyes widened in disbelief as the shards hovered for a moment before gently floating back onto the counter, neatly assembling themselves back into a pile. "Did you just?" Jack started, his voice trailing off as he struggled to understand what had just happened. Iris turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want you to see it. Please, you have to understand, this is not something I can control." Jack stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had never seen anything like this before. This wasn't just a simple trick. This was something real, something far beyond anything he had ever witnessed. He had heard stories of telekinesis, but never in his wildest dreams did he think he would see it with his own eyes. "Iris, what was that?" Jack asked, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. "How did you do that?" Iris lowered her gaze, her expression pained. "It's a part of us," she said quietly. "Our people have abilities, powers, if you will, but they are not without their costs. We were taught to control them, to keep them hidden. It's why we live the way we do, isolated, out of sight." Jack took a step closer, trying to understand. "What kind of powers? And why didn't you tell me about them?" Iris shook her head, her face shadowed with regret. "We didn't want to scare you. We didn't want you to think we were dangerous. The powers are unpredictable. Sometimes they appear when we least expect them, and they can be dangerous if we lose control. I can barely control mine. But why are you so scared?" "Of them? Jack asked gently, trying to reassure her. You've done nothing wrong. If you have these abilities, you shouldn't hide them. Irith looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. You don't understand, she said softly. When my people discovered these abilities, they thought they could use them to control others, to dominate. That's how we lost everything. We were seen as a threat by the rest of the galaxy. And now, because of what happened, we can never return to our world. We'll always be hunted. If others find out about what we can do, they will never leave us alone. Jack looked at Irith, his heart aching for her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear that had been buried deep inside her ever since she arrived. The last thing she wanted was to harm anyone, and yet she was afraid of the very powers that made her and her daughter unique. Powers that were meant to be a gift, not a curse. I won't let anyone hurt you, Irith, Jack said firmly. And I'm not afraid of you. You're not dangerous. Irith gave him a small, uncertain smile. You don't know what we're capable of. You don't know the consequences. Just then, Nira entered the room. She had been playing outside in the garden, and her face lit up when she saw Jack and Irith talking. She skipped over to them, her small feet making soft sounds against the floor. Irith? Nira asked, her voice soft. What's wrong? Irith knelt down to Nira's level, her hand resting on the child's shoulder. It's nothing, little one. Just some broken glass. She turned to Jack. I'm sorry. I didn't want to frighten you. Jack smiled at Nira. No need to apologize, Irith. I think we all just need to learn how to control these abilities together. Nira looked up at Jack with her big, curious eyes, then glanced at her mother. There was something different in her gaze now. It was as if she had been listening to the conversation, understanding more than she let on. I can help, Nira said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Irith looked at her daughter in surprise. What do you mean, Nira? The young girl stepped forward, her small hands raised slightly in front of her. Jack's eyes widened as he saw a faint shimmer of light surround Nira's hands. It was as though the air itself was bending around her, responding to her presence. Irith's voice trembled as she looked at her daughter. No, Nira, you're not ready. You're still too young. But Nira smiled, her face full of quiet determination. I can control it, Mama. I want to help. To Jack's amazement, the objects in the room, papers, cups, and small furniture began to float gently in the air, hovering with an almost graceful ease. Nira's eyes glowed faintly, her concentration intense but not strained. It was as if the young girl had already learned how to harness her own abilities, how to control the power that ran through her. Irith stood frozen, her mouth agape. She's already learning. Jack watched in awe as Nira continued to manipulate the objects around them. He had never seen anything like it before. How could a child so young have such control over her powers? Finally, after a few moments, Nira gently set the objects back down, her eyes flickering with exhaustion. She smiled, proud of what she had done. I did it, Nira said softly, looking up at Jack and Irith. Jack was speechless. He had known there was something extraordinary about Nira, but seeing her abilities firsthand left him in awe. You did, Jack said with a smile, his voice filled with pride. You're amazing, Nira. Irith, her voice barely a whisper, knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're incredible, she said softly, her voice filled with both wonder and fear. Jack could see the weight of the moment on Irith's face. Nira's powers were a gift, but they were also a danger. If others found out, they would become targets once again. But Jack knew one thing for certain. He would do everything he could to protect them, no matter what. The days had started to feel normal, almost peaceful. Jack, Irith, and Nira had settled into a new rhythm. Life, though far from perfect, had taken on a quiet sense of calm. Jack had come to care for them deeply, not out of obligation, but because of the bond they had formed. They were no longer just strangers in need of help. They had become family. But Jack knew that peace was often fleeting, especially when it came to matters beyond his understanding. As much as he had tried to make their life as normal as possible, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Something from Irith's past, something dangerous, was still lurking just beyond the horizon. It was a quiet morning when the first sign of trouble arrived. Jack had just finished his breakfast when he noticed Nira standing by the window, her eyes fixed on something outside. Her expression was hard to read, but there was a sense of unease in the way she stood, her small hands gripping the edge of the windowsill. "Nira," Jack called gently, walking over to her. "What's wrong?" Nira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the tree line at the edge of their property. Jack's eyes followed her gesture, and his heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it was just a shadow or an animal moving through the trees. But as he looked closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, hidden just out of sight, but clearly watching them. It was a silhouette, tall and lean, with no details that Jack could make out from this distance. "Who is that?" Jack asked, his voice tight with unease. Nira's face had gone pale. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They found us." Jack's stomach turned as he looked from Nira to Irith, who had entered the room at the sound of the conversation. Her face, once filled with relief and peace, was now shadowed with fear. She had seen it too. She had recognized the danger that was coming. "Irith," Jack said, his voice steady but urgent. "Who are they? What's happening?" Irith took a deep breath, her eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "They're hunters, from my world, my people. When we fled, they sent out teams to track us down. They've been looking for us ever since." Jack's mind raced. "But you said they were gone. I thought you were safe here." "We thought we were," Irith whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. "But my people never forget. They're relentless. These hunters, they won't stop until they capture us or ... or worse." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what kind of danger Irith and Nira had been running from, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't safe here anymore. Not with those hunters close by. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice urgent. "How do we stop them?" Irith looked at him, her expression torn. "There's no stopping them, not unless we leave." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. Leave? The idea of abandoning everything they had just started to build was unthinkable. They had just found a place to call home, a place where they could be safe, but he knew Irith was right. These hunters wouldn't stop, not until they had taken what they wanted. "We have to run," Irith said quietly. "We have to leave before they find us." Jack stood still for a moment, trying to process what Irith had said. The idea of running, of leaving the only home they had known, felt impossible. But he also knew that if they stayed, it would only be a matter of time before the hunters found them. And when that happened, things would get much worse. "I won't let them take you," Jack said firmly, his resolve hardening. "We'll figure this out." "We can't. Just run. There has to be another way." Irith shook her head. "There isn't. These hunters are trained to track us down, no matter where we go. If we stay, they'll find us. If we leave, we have a chance to get away." Jack looked at her, the determination in her eyes telling him everything he needed to. No, she wasn't giving up, and neither would he. But the fear in her voice made it clear that this was a battle they couldn't win alone. Jack had to make a choice. Either he could let them leave and try to keep them safe by running, or he could face whatever danger these hunters brought and protect them right here. The sound of a vehicle engine in the distance broke through his thoughts, the rumble growing louder as it approached their house. Jack's eyes narrowed. They were getting closer. "They're coming," Jack said, his voice low. Irith turned toward the door, her expression filled with a sense of urgency. "We don't have much time." Before Jack could say anything more, Nira spoke, her voice quiet but filled with a strange sense of certainty. "I can stop them," she said, her small hands trembling as she looked up at Jack. "I can stop them," she repeated, her voice stronger now, her gaze steady. Jack looked down at Nira, unsure of what she meant. How could a child stop armed hunters? But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something powerful. Nira wasn't just a frightened little girl anymore. She had grown stronger, her abilities emerging in ways Jack hadn't fully understood. "Irith, do you think she can control it?" Jack asked, his voice filled with both hope and fear. Irith hesitated for a moment, her gaze moving from Nira to Jack. "I don't know. Nira's powers are still unpredictable. But if she can control them, she could stop the hunters before they reach us." Nira stepped forward, her eyes focused, her hands outstretched as though reaching for something invisible. In the air. Jack watched in awe as the air around her seemed to shimmer, as though it were responding to her call. "I can protect you," Nira said, her voice calm but full of determination. "I will stop them." Jack felt his heart race as he realized the full weight of what Nira was offering. She wasn't just asking to help, she was offering to defend them, to fight back. And in that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't just about running away anymore. It was about standing together and fighting back. "You're not alone," Jack said softly, kneeling down to Nira's level. "We'll face this together. We'll protect each other." Irith nodded, a mix of pride and fear in her eyes. "We'll protect each other, no matter what." The sound of the vehicle grew louder, and Jack knew their time was running out. The hunters were almost here. "This is it," Jack said, his voice filled with both determination and fear. "We're not running anymore. We'll face them head on." The air was thick with tension as Jack, Irith, and Nira stood in the living room, waiting for the inevitable. The sound of the vehicle grew louder, its engine roaring as it neared their home. Jack's heart was racing, his mind filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. He had never been in a situation like this before. How could he protect them? He wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained to fight. But then he looked at Irith and Nira, and the answer was clear. He had to try. He would protect them no matter what. "Irith," Jack said, turning to her, "you and Nira should stay inside. If these hunters come for us, I'll hold them off. You can't risk getting hurt." Irith's eyes narrowed. "No, Jack, we're in this together. I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Jack hesitated. He knew Irith was strong, but he couldn't bear the thought of her being hurt. "Please," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Let me do this. I'll protect you both. You can't put yourselves at risk." Irith looked at him, her eyes filled with an intensity that made his resolve waver. "Jack, we've been running our whole lives. We're not running anymore. We're staying, and we're fighting." Before Jack could protest, Nira stepped forward. Her eyes, though young, were filled with the same determination Jack saw in her mother. "I can help," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling slightly. Jack looked down at Nira, unsure of how to respond. Could she really help? But when he saw the fierce look in her eyes, he knew this wasn't just some child's wish. Nira was ready. She had been ready long before this moment. "Okay," Jack said, finally giving in. "We face them together then, but we do this carefully. We wait until they get close, and then we make our move." The three of them waited in silence, the tension building with every passing second. Jack could hear the sound of the vehicle getting closer. It was only a matter of time before they arrived at the house. Jack tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the task ahead. He had no idea how they were going to get through this, but he knew they had to try. Moments later, the vehicle came into view. A sleek black hovercraft hovered just outside their home, its engines making a low hum as it landed softly on the ground. Jack's grip tightened around the metal rod he had found in the garage, his makeshift weapon. He glanced at Irith and Naira, both of them standing beside him, ready for whatever came next. The doors of the hovercraft opened, and two figures stepped out. Jack could barely make out their forms through the dim light, but there was no mistaking their purpose. They were hunters, there was no doubt in his mind about that. They were tall, imposing figures dressed in dark armor that reflected the light. Their faces were hidden behind helmets, but Jack could see the weapons they carried. These weren't ordinary people. These were trained soldiers sent to capture or kill. Irith stepped forward, her expression hardening. "They've come for us," she said, her voice steady, though Jack could hear the tension in it. "They won't stop until they have us." Jack nodded, tightening his grip on the rod. "Then we stop them before they get any closer." Irith raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Wait," she said, her voice low. "I'll try to use my abilities. If I can distract them, we might have a chance." Jack was about to argue, but then he saw the look in Irith's eyes. She was resolute, ready to do whatever it took to protect them. He trusted her, and he knew this was their only shot. "I'll keep them busy," Irith whispered. "Naira, you stay close to Jack. Do not let them take him." Naira nodded, her eyes bright with determination. She didn't need to be told twice. She was ready, just like her mother. Irith stepped forward, her hand outstretched toward the approaching hunters. Jack could feel the tension in the air, thickening like a storm about to break. Then, with a sudden movement, Irith thrust her hand forward, and Jack saw the air ripple as if some invisible force had taken hold. The two hunters faltered for a moment, caught off guard. Jack saw the confusion in their movements as they looked at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was enough to buy them a few precious seconds. "Now!" Jack shouted, grabbing Naira's hand and pulling her behind him. He sprinted toward the edge of the property, the sounds of the hunters' confused voices fading behind them. He had no idea what kind of powers Irith was using, but he didn't question it. All that mattered was getting away. But just as they reached the edge of the yard, one of the hunters broke free from Irith's distraction. He raised his weapon and fired. The shot missed, but Jack felt the heat of it brush against his skin. His heart pounded as he grabbed Naira and pulled her behind. Large tree, using it as cover. "Stay here," Jack whispered urgently to Naira. "Stay hidden. I'll handle them." Naira nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. She knew what needed to be done. Jack turned to face the approaching hunters, his mind racing. He had no plan, no strategy, just a burning desire to protect the people he had come to love. As the hunters closed in, Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward, gripping his makeshift weapon tightly. He would do whatever it took to protect them. The first hunter lunged at him, raising his weapon to strike. Jack swung the rod with all his strength, connecting with the hunter's armor with a resounding thud. The hunter staggered back, stunned but not defeated. Jack's heart pounded as he tried to keep his footing, knowing that this was just the beginning. Suddenly, Ida's voice rang out from behind him. "Jack, get down!" Without thinking, Jack dropped to the ground, just as a burst of energy shot past him, hitting the second hunter square in the chest. The hunter fell to the ground, unconscious, as Irith stood behind him, her hand still extended. Jack looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. Irith gave him a tired smile. We did it. Together. The tension in the air slowly began to fade as the last of the hunters fell to the ground, incapacitated by Irith's powers. Jack stood up, breathing heavily, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the confrontation. He had never thought his life would come to this, a fight to protect not just his home, but two alien beings who had somehow become his family. Irith lowered her hand, her face pale with exhaustion. The effort of using her powers had drained her more than she let on. Nira stepped out from behind the tree, her small hands clutching the fabric of Jack's shirt, her eyes wide with both fear and awe. "Are they gone?" Nira asked softly, her voice trembling. Jack glanced at the fallen hunters. They were unconscious, their weapons lying just out of reach. Irith's powers had been more than enough to stop them, but Jack couldn't help but feel uneasy. These hunters weren't just any ordinary enemies. They were relentless, and there were likely more of them out there. "They're not going to hurt us anymore," Jack said, his voice firm. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here. We'll need to find somewhere safe." Irith nodded slowly, her expression filled with worry. "They'll send more. They won't stop until they find us." "We'll be ready," Jack said, trying to reassure her. "But we need to leave. We need to get away from here before they regroup." The sound of approaching vehicles in the distance made Jack's heart race again. They didn't have much time. The first wave of hunters had been dealt with, but Jack knew this wasn't over. "Not yet. Get to the back of the house," Jack said. "Urgently. We'll take the back roads. It's the fastest way out of here." Irith and Nira followed Jack as he led them toward the back of the property, moving quickly but quietly. Jack kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, his mind racing. Where could they go? Where could they hide, even for just a little while? The world felt so much bigger and more dangerous now, and Jack realized that protecting Irith and Nira wouldn't be easy. As they reached the back gate, Jack paused, glancing back toward the house. The hunter's vehicle was now parked in front, blocking the road. Jack felt the weight of the moment press down on him. If they stayed any longer, they would be cornered. They had no choice but to move quickly. "Irith," Jack said, turning to her, "can you take Nira? I'll lead the way. We have to keep moving." Irith nodded, her face a mix of determination and exhaustion. "I won't leave her behind." They stepped through the back gate and into the narrow path that led to the woods. The trees were dense, their branches forming a thick canopy above, casting the ground in shadow. Jack could feel the cool, damp air as they moved, the quiet rustling of the leaves the only sound breaking the silence. It was strange, almost peaceful compared to the chaos they had just faced. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. "Irith, we need a plan," Jack said quietly, his mind already working on their next move. "We can't just keep running forever. We need somewhere safe, a place to lay low." Irith glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and worry. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. There's a place far from here. It's an old hideout, a safe house of sorts. We used it when we first came to Earth, before everything went wrong." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it's still safe after all this time?" Irith hesitated. "It should be, but it's been years since I've been there. There's no guarantee, but it's our best shot." "Then that's where we're going," Jack said firmly. "Lead the way." Irith nodded, and they continued through the woods, moving quickly but carefully. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but think about how much had changed in such a short time. He had gone from living a quiet, solitary life to becoming the protector of two aliens. And now they were on the run, trying to escape hunters who would stop at nothing to find them. Jack glanced back at Nira, who was walking closely beside Irith, her small hand held tightly in her mother's. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. It was hard for Jack to imagine how much fear she must have felt over the years, living on the run, always hiding. He wished he could take that fear away, but he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do was try his best to keep her safe. The sun was beginning to set as they reached the edge of the woods. In the distance, Jack could see a small building tucked between two hills, an old, weathered cabin that looked almost abandoned. Irith quickened her pace, her footsteps growing faster as they neared the cabin. "That's it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the safe house." Jack felt a rush of relief as they reached the cabin. The building was small, made of wood and stone, with a chimney that still looked intact. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was better than being out in the open. They entered the cabin cautiously, Jack keeping watch as Irith and Mira stepped inside. The interior was dark, dust covering the floors and furniture. It looked abandoned, just as Irith had described, but it was solid and secure. Jack closed the door behind them, the sound of it clicking shut echoing in the silence. "We'll stay here for the night," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll rest and figure out our next move in the morning." Irith nodded, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Thank you, Jack, for everything. I don't know what we would have done without you." Jack smiled, though there was still a heaviness in his chest. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together. You and Naira are my family now." Irith looked at him, her expression softening. "I never thought I would find a place like this again," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I never thought we would be safe, but here we are." Jack walked over to the small fireplace, starting a fire to warm the cabin. "We'll figure this out," he said, glancing back at Irith and Naira. "We'll stay safe, together." As the fire crackled to life, Jack looked around the small cabin. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. They were safe for now, and they would face whatever came next together, no matter what the future held. Jack knew one thing for sure. He would protect them, he would fight for them, and he would make sure they had a future where they didn't have to run anymore.